Linda Hirsch, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education. Welcome back for part 2 of our examination of Mayor Bill de Blasio's record on education. Is mayoral control of the city schools resulting in better education for our students? 3 reporters from Chalkbeat join me for a look at the progress of the mayor's campaign for equity and excellence. Promises made and promises kept. Part 2, coming up on EdCast. My guests today are Monica DeSerre, Christina Vega, and Alex Zimmerman. They are reporters for Chalkbeat, an online nonprofit news organization committed to covering issues in education in cities across the country. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of this conversation. In part 1 of our conversation on the mayor's education record, promises made, promises kept, we had the chance to look at a number of reforms and programs that he promised to improve education. We had a chance to look at universal literacy, universal pre-K, community schools, charter schools, and now I'd like to continue this conversation to look at some more components of what the mayor said he was going to do. So, Alex, I believe in part 1 you made a point of telling us that we're really looking not just at what Bill de Blasio is doing, but what he's doing vis-a-vis what Mike Bloomberg had done prior to him, and that there's a very different mindset and attitude about what's happening in terms of education. One of the biggest issues, I think, that focuses on that is the failing schools and the struggling schools. We know that Mayor Bloomberg's approach was to close them, and he felt that the school wasn't functioning well enough, it didn't deserve to be open, and so let's shut it down. And a lot of families, parents, teachers really felt that this was a negative approach and not an effective way of dealing with this. So Mayor de Blasio has looked at this in a different way. Let's talk a little bit about how he's handling the struggling school or the school that is not doing well. What's he been doing?
Yeah, so his approach is basically to flood these schools with extra academic resources, extra social service resources, and give them time to improve. You're exactly right. Something like 150 schools closed in the Bloomberg years that they said weren't measuring up. And that contrasts sharply with this administration. It's been a relative handful of schools that have been closed so far. The renewal program is de Blasio's flagship program for the lowest performing schools in the city. I think it's a little confusing. All renewal schools are community schools. So the community school program is a centerpiece of renewal, but it's not the only piece of it. If you visit renewal schools, they are often getting extra coaches who are helping implement new curricula. They're getting lots of instructional help. Sometimes the principals are getting coaching. There's a lot more sort of academic side involvement than you would necessarily get in a community school. That doesn't mean community schools aren't also getting academic interventions. Renewal schools are also all extending the school day. And they each get a community school director who is sort of the quarterback of this effort, who is, sort of the bridge between the academic side of what a school is doing and the social service side of what a school is doing, right? Because principals have a lot on their plates already. Managing an entire suite of social services is a huge task on top of that.
So, of course, the question is, how successful are these renewal schools? So what's the word?
Yeah, so I think you can point to examples of great success, and you can point to examples of schools that are still floundering. I think if you sort of if you kind of take the long view, if you hear what lots of advocates say, they will tell you that real school improvement takes 3 to 5 years, sometimes longer. That said, I think the evidence for success so far, according to universal statistical analyses, is fairly mixed. I think you see evidence that some schools are making strides, some schools are boosting attendance, and chronic absenteeism is down, but you also see schools that aren't making improvements in test scores and graduation rates that are comparable to similar schools that didn't get those interventions.
You did bring up the issue of, is there really enough time? And I know that is what the mayor will say and has said, that it's unrealistic to think that in 2 to 3 years, I know that's the time frame he's been given, that you can really make these miracles happen when there's so much that has to fall into place for these schools to do better. But that said, what we're looking at now from the short window frame is that there's not great results yet.
I think it's mixed.
Okay.
I think if Mayor de Blasio's critics will say that that kind of time horizon isn't fair to students. A lot of if you listen to Families for Excellent Schools, which is a pro-charter
So
advocacy
they'll
group,
say it should be even shorter, or
they'll say no, that these schools, that it's not fair to leave students in schools that are this low performing, and that they should either be closed or, in their view, ideally sent to charter schools.
Now, another promise that he made was to reduce class size. And, a lot of people feel the class size, a small classroom, is really crucial to having a good classroom experience for students. How has he been doing in delivering on reducing class size?
As far as I know, there hasn't really been any real effort that the mayor has undertaken to make a dent in that. So
I know that people who believe in reducing class size are feeling that he's not done very much in this front at all. Do you think he wants to, or that he's making any effort in that direction, or you're not seeing anything happening there?
It honestly is not something that the city does a whole lot of talking about. It's not something that they're actively pressing. At least tell you guys, feel free to correct me, but I don't often hear from the press office saying like we're really trying to make a dent in class size. Would you please cover this sort of policy proposal? They do often say when class size issues come up that they have committed to creating thousands of new seats, and we'll point to
putting them all in the same classroom,
or we'll point to their capital plan, which does allow for new school construction. I think there are questions about whether that is enough to keep pace and what the sort of time scale of that will be.
There are some other groups of students who feel pretty neglected by the school system overall. And those are special education, special needs students, and English language learners. And I believe, again, in the Campaign for Equity and Excellence, the mayor spoke to trying to do better for these groups of students. So where are we on that? Any progress, Monica, that you've seen?
Right. I think certainly English language learners is something that matters a lot to Carmen Farina.
Yes.
I think one slight issue that we've seen in this regard is that the graduation rate for English language learners actually decreased last year. You can make some technical arguments about how significant the decrease was and whether it was sort of a classification issue, but I think a lot of advocates for this population were pretty disheartened by that result.
The dropout rate also increased for English language learners. The graduation rate is about 27% for current students who are learning English. If you combine students who have learned enough English to test out of that status, it's about 51%.
Now, as a person who personally has had a lot of experience in working with English language learners myself, why do you think that the results are not better on this, and what might be done to make this better?
I think, when it comes to graduation specifically, it's really, really tough because
the Regents the problem?
You have to pass an English Regents exam, and there are exceptions, and the bar is not necessarily as high, but you're required to read all of, there are 5 English exams. You have to know things like United States history. You have to know how to take an English test. So I think those are very difficult hurdles.
Now, the other side of that argument is, on the other hand, we're talking about college readiness. And if we want these students to graduate the New York City High School, we know that many of our students, unfortunately, graduate the New York City High School and enter CUNY needing developmental courses in English and math very often. So the other argument for this is when you graduate high school, you should have certain proficiency levels that enable you to succeed. So it seems, and yes, it's not fair to expect somebody who's just learning a language to pass a Regents exam. In terms of the pedagogy, or in terms of what's happening in the schools, do you see any programs or initiatives coming that might make this better?
The city is expanding language programs, dual language, bilingual programs, and schools would say that it's probably more fair to look at their 6-year graduation rate to ensure that students are persisting in school, even if it takes them a little more than 4 years. At least they're graduating, and they have that level of proficiency to be able to go on to college.
I spoke, as you know, with David Bloomfield when the Campaign for Equity and Excellence was announced, and I asked him about the campaign and again what he saw as perhaps one of the biggest problems with the Campaign for Equity and Excellence. So let's hear what he has to say. What else is missing from this vision that the mayor has presented?
Well, in my opinion, the reason that this isn't transformative is it maintains the tale of two cities, the haves and have-nots, and it throws some new programs toward the have-nots, but it maintains separation, and separate is not equal.
Separate in what way?
Well, we have one of the most segregated school systems in the country.
Okay.
We have many schools that are 90 or 95% or more students of color, low-income students of color. And I think what the mayor really needs to do to raise the achievement level overall.
Why is that so important? People ask me, why is it so important? If I'm giving equal resources, why does it matter so much that the schools be better integrated?
Well, there are two main reasons, and going back to somewhat of a third, the Supreme Court says you can't.
Okay.
Separate can never be equal, said the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education.
It's inherently unequal.
So, and the reason it's inherently unequal is because resources follow wealth. And in this country, wealth is race-based. And so there are two reasons. One is the resource element, and the other is that diversity is just a good thing in and of itself. To have different opinions, different backgrounds, that we really need diversity to come up with good education.
According to David Bloomfield, one of the big problems with this campaign is the fact that it does not address the segregated school system that we currently have in the city, and that in spite of the mayor's proclamations, this is still a tale of two cities, the haves and the have-nots. And there are many people, I believe, who would agree that this is one of the issues. What kinds of progress is being made here?
Well, the city recently announced its plan to tackle this issue, although they do not explicitly use the words integration or segregation. They call it a diversity plan, and according to them, it's just sort of the first step towards working with the community on a larger plan. So some of the goals in the plan are to decrease the number of students who are in schools that are racially stratified and economically stratified. Advocates say that the goals are very low, and in fact there was a recent report that showed that the goals could probably be met just through changing demographics in the city. But you have other advocates too who say it's a win that we're even talking about this issue. There are a lot of people out there who don't even realize that we still have segregated schools. So it's a mixed bag for sure, but the city has put out a plan to address.
You know, some people say that it's not all that complicated. You know, you could do it if you really wanted to. What do you think makes it difficult for the mayor? Or, you know, you're right that the report said that what he's doing, you know, could just happen anyway. It's a very low bar that he set. Are there other, why do you think he's having problems doing a more aggressive approach toward this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a ton of barriers to creating integrated schools. There's definitely just practical barriers. Some areas of the city, there's a lot of different incomes, a lot of different races living in close proximity. Some areas of the city, you know, you'd really have to go a long way in order to get schools integrated. So there's definitely practical issues. There's also, this is really tricky politically. There's a lot of families that might not be interested in this as a strategy, and
which you've seen.
If it means they lose access to a school that they see as high performing, you hear a lot of, I bought or I rented my apartment so my child could go to this school, and Mayor de Blasio has said things to that effect when asked about this issue.
And I think crucially, even in this plan, he doesn't use the words integration. He doesn't use the words segregation. He uses
Those are hot button terms,
diversity. And the state actually has started down this path too, and they were very clear they wanted to use integration and segregation, and they made that statement.
I think one other important sort of practical challenge is the school system is predominantly Black and Hispanic. So what sort of system-wide integration would look like just in a practical way? Like what sorts of thresholds make sense? Like what the mechanism should be to achieve that are also not just obvious questions. It's not even as if you just said integrate the school, it's not obvious what that would mean necessarily.
You also have to think about communities of color, and historically integration has meant that they lose access to schools that have been in their neighborhood or PTAs that they've been able to run. And so you can't assume that any one constituency is really all for.
That's interesting. So you're saying there could be resistance all around and not just where you think you might find it. I want to go to another area, and that is the classroom environment. I think one of the reasons parents say they like charters is because they think they have a more controlled, disciplined classroom environment. And we might say, sure, because they can dismiss students who don't fit the mold. But that does bring us to the question of what's happening in the classroom. And many people who feel that one or two disruptive students in a class can ruin the experience for everyone in that classroom. And I don't want to minimize parents who are really concerned about that. And of course, on the other hand, we've seen a lot of minority children suspended at disproportionate rates. So we have a real issue going on here that I think the mayor has also promised to address in terms of classroom discipline and suspensions and how he handles the school environment. What do we know about that? How's that going?
Yeah, so this has been a huge piece of de Blasio's agenda. It's actually an issue that has taken hold nationally. It is increasingly seen as a civil rights issue. This disproportionate treatment of students with disabilities, of students of color, having those students be suspended at disproportionate rates. So there have been a series of policy shifts that have made it more challenging for schools to suspend students for infractions that are generally considered to be more subjective. So
minority children really tend to be punished for more frequently.
Right. So if you take an offense like insubordination, which is a fairly low level infraction, but is sort of unclear how that might be applied, and there's an argument that it invites bias when you have sort of a disciplinary infraction that is sort of open-ended and could be applied to lots of different kinds of behavior. So what we've seen over the past few years is suspensions have fallen pretty significantly. You see that year over year in the suspension data, and how that's playing out in classrooms is really interesting. And you hear different perspectives. Now, it is also important to note that there has been this sort of like counterpart effort to replace suspensions with something else, often known as restorative justice.
We did a show on restorative justice, so tell us a little bit about restorative justice and how that's working.
This is Alex's expertise.
So restorative justice, I think, is the idea that instead of punitive approaches to student misbehavior, you'll have sort of more deliberative approaches. You'll have students sort of talking through incidents. You'll sort of bring the people in who are involved and sort of try to get to the bottom of what is sort of at the root of that disagreement, instead of removing students from either the school or the classroom setting. The argument being that it is not a particularly constructive learning experience to remove a student from school.
So that if you've offended another student or done something, you really have to confront that other student personally and apologize and say what you've done. It's a whole other system. So again, as I said, there are really two different sides of looking at this, because you cannot blame parents for wanting a calm school environment for their children, and yet this thing of suspending students, for minor things perhaps, or for not really handling these issues well, has really been a problem. Now, when we spoke to the chancellor again, she expressed another component that she viewed as crucial to education and what she hoped would happen. So let's listen to her again.
I think what you have in Finland, that hopefully we're moving in that direction, is to raise the respect and dignity of teachers. To me, that's crucial for success. And that's something we've been working on. Everything we've done here, I think that the respect factor is crucial. A lot of celebration of teachers, a lot of shouting out teachers who do extra good work. And last year when we had our teacher celebration, instead of bringing everybody here, we went to visit them in their schools and surprised them. They didn't know they were being awarded. We took balloons, we took people, and the joy that they all had was about, this is a job I love doing, but we need to let the rest of the world know this is how we view this profession.
The chancellor says that one of the things that she has wanted to work on is raising the respect that people show teachers and raising respect for the profession itself. And I have to say that in all the years that we've been doing EdCast, we hear this all the time about teachers. So, do you think that the mayor and this chancellor are helping to raise respect for teachers and are helping others understand that teaching is a craft? What do you think?
Well, de Blasio's appointment of Carmen Farina as chancellor is one big signal, right? She was a classroom teacher, she was a principal, she's been in the system for over 50 years now. I think that was a clear signal that he values that experience and that it's important.
So do you think that teachers are getting more respect than they used to, from what you can see?
I think in terms of, I cover a lot of state policy issues, and I think they've gotten some help from Albany in terms of the things that they wanted to do. The Board of Regents is also a lot of former educators. They no longer have state tests in teacher evaluations. They're looking at teacher certification requirements to make it a little bit less arduous to go through. So I think some of the more tangible things that teachers will see are coming out of Albany right now.
Certainly there are countries around the world, Finland, which is known for its superior educational system, in which teachers feel they have a lot of respect, that it's a profession that's respected. So I guess the question will be, are we able to make steps? And I think your point about appointing a teacher, a schools person to run the schools was a departure from what had been previously done by Mayor Bloomberg. So maybe that will be a step in the right direction. We're running out of time, as I always say to my guests, so I'm going to ask you each, when you look at this campaign for equity and excellence, tell me what you think was a major promise kept and a major promise broken. Just quickly, Alex, promise kept?
Yeah, so I think a major promise kept is, they've obviously committed to rolling out a number of these initiatives. They have actually hired a number of single shepherds. They are actually making a big push on computer science.
And that's the guidance system that we didn't get to talk to.
Right.
Okay.
I think a downside, this is maybe not as much a promise not kept, but a downside of that approach that comes through in some of the reporting on struggling schools is this is sort of a patchwork of programs. It is less clear to some people sort of how they all interlock and how they all add up to like a larger whole that's supposed to be improving the experience of like all students. Like what if you're at a school that isn't part of the single shepherd program or that isn't getting computer science right away?
What do you say, promise kept?
Promise kept, probably pre-K. Parents are very happy with it. There are, of course, issues. It's not perfect, but it's a huge improvement from what there was before. And probably I would say there's a lot more work to be done on the school integration issue, and advocates will be watching to see just how forcefully the DOE, the Department of Education, and the mayor move on this issue.
Monica, promise kept and promise to be kept.
Sure. I think similar to Alex, sort of big picture-wise, promise kept, they really did put a lot of inputs into the system. They're not afraid to put a lot of resources into schools. Promise, I think, question mark, whether those inputs are going to yield the type of results that we want to see for kids.
I want to thank you all again for really taking the time to sit with me and go through this very ambitious program and look at this mayor's record, because he wants to be the education mayor, and I think you've really helped us see the big picture, and I really want to thank you all for that again. Monica DeSera, Christina Vega, Alex Zimmerman from Chalkbeat. So thank you so much for joining us today. Don't go away. We'll be right back with our Ed Bites. Welcome back to this edition of Ed Bites. A previous EdCast examined the issues faced by Black girls in school. Now, Youth Today reports that a new study by the Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Inequality provides support for what some have long suspected. The study, titled Girlhood Interrupted: The Erasures of Black Girls' Childhood, reveals that young Black girls are often viewed as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers. Those surveyed felt that Black girls need less nurturing, less protection, and less support. Respondents also viewed Black girls as more independent and more knowledgeable about sex. The study's researchers point to the implications of these results and say they may account for the unequal rates of punishment shown Black girls in the juvenile and school systems. It may be time to rethink our definition of sports. Some believe video gaming falls into this category. The reasoning? It requires hours of practice, physical and mental abilities, and teamwork. According to eSchool News, at the Chicago High School Esports Invitational, trophies were awarded, and there was even a $1,200 first place prize. So gaming is gaining credibility as a true sport, minus the sweat. eSchool News also reports that students with autism can benefit from art, music, and recreation. Multidisciplinary activities help these students acquire important skills. For example, art therapy fosters imagination and abstract thinking, along with visual and spatial skills. Using music in the form of singable stories can aid in reading comprehension for young children, and recreational therapy can promote motor function and skills used in sports and exercise. Last month, we reported on the April March for Science held in Washington, D.C., along with the need to strengthen science education. Educators may be facing formidable challenges to address these concerns. Education Week reports on a national poll in which teachers said that most middle and high school students are not interested in science, math, or even space. The poll, commissioned by Lockheed Martin, asked 1,000 U.S. teachers about their views on student interest in science and math. Only 38% said the majority of their students seem naturally interested in the STEM areas. That's it for this edition of EdCast. Till next time, class dismissed. Thank you.